Dina Shell, this is Amy Gill, and we're going to be telling you about our Life Stories project, which is one strand of a larger inquiry funded by the Australian Research Council, and that's called Carer Activism and Advocacy. First of all, though, we did want to acknowledge that I work for the University of Adelaide, and the University of Adelaide is located on Kaurna land, so I wanted to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Kaurna people. For the Life Stories project, Amy and I have been collecting biographies of Australians. Competition. And we've been collecting short form biographies or life stories of Australians, as well as international people who have some influence on particularly on Australian culture. And we've been doing, our focus is on people who've been displaced from their families as children. And we haven't differentiated between people who've been displaced informally, so family might have organised that, or whether it's been statutory mistake has organised it. We've been inclusive of that. So hence this collage of faces. These are some of the people in our collection. The intention of the online database is actually to present these biographies to illustrate the contributions to community that people who've been displaced from their families have made to the wider community. And we don't discount the trauma and difficulties. We have trigger warnings, etc., on the database. But what we want to do is emphasise the contribution to community, which we consider very broadly. So that might be something like some people just have kept their own children. They've never had them put into the child protection system. And some people have become the Prime Minister of Australia. So one of the stories in our collection is one of my most favourite people, actually. This is Bernard Smith. And this is a portrait of Bernard Smith that actually hangs in Australia's National Portrait Gallery in Canberra. He came to be known as a leading Australian intellectual. He's regarded as the father of Australian art history and a considerable influence beyond art, even in anthropology and other areas of Australian cultural life. Yet, who would have expected this of Benny, as Smith was known, when he was a foster child, awarded the New South Wales state back when he was a child, early in the 20th century. After all, when Benny was in foster care, boys were expected to become labourers and girls were expected to become domestic servants. Benny knew all about stigma of being in foster care, even then, even as a small boy at the age of 9, because he'd been taunted and bullied by other children at school. And so his strategy for managing that, he was very small for his size, and he didn't want to physically fight them, but he put on this tough persona. And he talks about becoming a little toughie, and he'd leave home to go to school, shake up his hair, put back his shoulders, do all that sort of stuff. And then when he came home, he would tidy himself up a little bit. And he talks about how being a toughie allowed him to be safe at school. The other kids left him at home. Disturbingly, though, neighbours, adults in his community, saw him, because he was a state kid, as a dangerous child, and they actually thought that he should be put in an institution and not living next door. As I said, boys were expected to become labourers. Benny's foster mother didn't want that for Benny. Instead, she encouraged him to stay at school, and he did that. But he was also supported in that by something that I call structural openings. There was a special school opened during the Great Depression, and he was able to go to that for a few years. Later on, it was his wife, actually, who encouraged him to go to university. He went on to work as an academic at both the University of Melbourne and the University of Sydney. And his influence continues today, because in 1991, he set up an award for Aboriginal Australians across a range of creative fields. But when we think of children in out-of-home care, as we call it in Australia, do we think of people like Bernard Smith? There's a really important point that Lem Sisse makes around how we don't make connections between superheroes and popular fictional characters like Harry Potter and Superman and the real actual child in foster care. And he says that we don't, because we don't equate children in care with greatness or goodness. And yet, as he says, children in care use extraordinary skills to deal with extraordinary situations on a daily basis. The same, I think, can be said about actual people who've been in care and who've gone on to make contributions to their communities. Like, I won't go ahead, so there is something. Like I mentioned Harry Potter, Superman, like Len Sissay, like Sinead O'Connor, and like Australian great Archie Roach. Instead, kids in care all too often experience discrimination and stigma, or what Andrew Harvey calls the soft bigotry of low expectations. To display or not to display, to tell or not to tell, to let on or not to let on, to lie or not to lie, and in each case, to whom and when and where. These are the dilemmas for the stigmatised, writes Irving Goffman. According to his biographer, Sheridan Palmer, Bernard Smith never told anyone about being in foster care until after he retired, at which time that knowledge could not damage his reputation or his career. However, as Melissa Levin and Medora Barnes argue, the 21st century has seen a trend of stigmatised actors engaging in destigmatisation discourses as social and political strategies to manage or neutralise their deviant identities. They say, and I quote, increasingly people are choosing visibility over silence, exhibition instead of concealment, flaunting, Goffman would have called that. And that's how we see our database of life stories. It's a way of flaunting instead of hiding, flaunting instead of invisibilising, flaunting instead of feeling ashamed. And the life stories, I think, importantly, are a really important way for us to educate the wider community about who caregivers and care experienced people are. But it's also really important for young people in care to have a community of whom they feel proud. As one of our participants said, I wish I'd had something like this when I was.
Thanks, Steve. So, as Dee explained, many people who've been involved with this project have told us how that has helped increase their sense of belonging. So, how did this happen? Well, the project is participatory research. So, the majority of the research team are care experienced. So, this project is both by us and about us. Our advisory team is made up of care experienced people and allies, professionals, and researchers. And this is where the idea to create an interactive timeline of the history of Australian caregiver activism began. But the biography strand, which we're here to talk about today, includes life stories of both prominent care experienced people as well as everyday Australians. So this project builds community. And this can be especially important for those of us with histories of disrupted attachment in childhood or who may have questioned their identity as a result of growing up in the care system. The project is also about increasing the visibility of out-of-home care, because visibility can help normalize care identity. And finally, it's the most important part of this project, I think, is that it allows people to tell stories the way they want them to be told. So it's also a reminder of the legacies of growing up in care. How the legacies of growing up in care extend throughout the life course in complex ways, which I understand here. So these transcend quantified variables, which are normally things like rates of incarceration or drug and alcohol addiction. But care experience impacts each of us very differently. So many in their interviews shared how their life stories have shaped their personal relationships, and the legacies of care have influenced career trajectories, family formation, and even entire worldviews. So care experience is a shared identity, but we are by no means a homogenous group. So this word cloud includes the just many terms that care experienced people in Australia use to describe themselves. And it's important to note that this includes foster and kinship care, things like historical work placements, which are tantamount to indentured servitude, as well as all kinds of institutions, from group homes, orphanages, juvenile detention centers, everything is represented. So, while by no means representative of the care experience population as a whole, this paragraph can give you an indication of the diversity of contributions to society via employment among people who've participated in this project. So, many people who participated are represented in more than one area, particularly so writing is very overrepresented, and that's because a lot of people who've published things like a memoir or maybe an academic publication or they're a novelist or whatever it is have also had other careers. So you may or may not know that Barack Obama, Samantha Morton, and English-born Australian Senator Andrew Murray, former Senator Andrew Murray, are all care experienced. So Murray was instrumental in bringing about the national apology to the stolen generations in Australia. And Morton has used her celebrity platform to campaign against the privatization of out-of-home care services here in the UK. But each of the less we know, or everyday Australians in these photographs, are also care experienced people whose stories and lives matter as well. So in interviews, a lot of people describe to us how they are overcommitting themselves to the cause in the hopes that one day the care system will finally adequately meet the needs of children and families. And then other people describe feeling compelled to achieve more than those who are not care experienced, to defy negative stereotypes or simply individual assumptions about our potential. So this is an example of what sociologists broadly refer to as stigma compensation. So on the one hand, highlighting these life stories of very high achieving care experienced people portrays narratives of survival over adversity, but at the same time, these stories can exacerbate the pressure that care experienced people already face to outperform our peers in the majority of the population just so we can be seen as good enough. So in conclusion, stigma towards care experienced people is rife. And this may even be one of the contributing factors to why some people who originally decided to become involved in the project ultimately decided to keep their identities or even their stories private. But that's the benefit of an invisible stigmatized identity, right? Is that we get to choose when or whether we disclose. So I'd like to conclude by pointing out that this project has really shown how when out-of-home care policy, practice, or research are being discussed, sometimes those who are at the table might not realize that we as care experienced people are already in the room.